Hi guys, how are you doing? A lot of talking so far, huh? And that trend will continue now. What I will say is that we front load a little bit of these conversations at the very beginning to allow for there to be more interactivity as we go through. So a lot of us learn in different ways, right? Some people learn from speaking, some people learn from hearing, some people learn from writing or having like very like tactical skills that incorporate things. What I think majority of us in this room can say that we learn particularly well from is from actually participating and doing, right? In restaurants, particularly, but also in hospitality in general, we tend to be very visceral, we tend to be very action oriented. And so a lot of your training process will be about that. But one of the things that's important to us is that you have context and shade. So oftentimes in an opening process, right, there's a certain amount of information that I'm aware of from creating a brand, right? The branding, the subtext, the idea of what the space is meant to be. Then there's a deeper level that comes in from culinary and that you're aware of from a perspective of what the restaurant is trying to achieve and what the goals are. That is typically sitting with a lot of the management team. There's very little flow through that typically hits people who are actively out there engaging on the front lines of either creating the product that goes in front of guests or affecting the guest experience directly. And the goal is none of us are better or worse in our roles. We simply have a division of responsibility. And I think Natalie can attest to this from having gone through this before. The goal is that you have as much subtext as the people who created the brand when you walk into day one. So in my mind, right, you guys should be aware of what the service that we're looking to portray is meant to be, right? As much as we've discussed it in our heads so that it's not just about the feeling that you provide tableside, but you also knowing what this whole thing is supposed to be, right? And so those conversations are things that we're going to go through. So for example, today, this conversation that we're having is one that is more like high level about who we are and what service and hospitality mean to us. We'll be talking a little bit about emotional intelligence later, which is relevant to any position. I don't care whether it's back of the house or front of the house. And then we'll start going through a little bit more details about the brand. So it's like we start high level and then we go through granularity. So tomorrow we'll start having conversations about what the Duro brand is. We'll have conversations about what the design intent for different spaces are. And then we'll start having conversations about menus, about service styles, all of those. It'll all flow out. The goal being that you guys have information at your fingertips so that you feel like you are the experts and the owners of the space. And it just doesn't sit with a small few group of people who are designated as being at the top of the pyramid, right? So that being said, one of the things that I think is important is going through who everyone is. My name is Alex Wolf. I have been with this organization for a little bit over 2 years. I started in hospitality in roles like everyone here is sitting in, right? Many, many years ago, which I will not go through how many years ago it was, but I will just say it was back when we didn't have electric power in spaces. That being said, I worked in spaces as an hourly employee where I would often not be the teacher's pet, nor was I the one who caused a lot of issues, right? And so I wouldn't hear anything because I was a middle of the road type of employee until I caught a manager or some leader on a bad day and they snapped at me and said, don't do this, or do this way, right? Rarely at that time in restaurants that I can remember, or at least I wasn't provided from the people who were guiding me, an understanding of why something is done, right? And so one of the conversations that we had as a management team recently are like the different levels of leadership, and like the weakest level of leadership is you do this because I say that you're going to do it, right? Nobody's compelled by that. Nobody's invested in that. All it does is create, a sort of us versus them mentality between people who are defined as having global responsibilities and people who are defined as having local responsibilities, right? So in this, one of our goals is to give you the why, the reasoning behind things, because typically there is a logic that has been employed that defines why we have chosen a route as to how to accomplish some step or some goal overall in the process, right? Every single person who's here comes from different spaces, right? I'll give an abstract or a singular example of something. Some of you might have come from a space where you had to use a tray to bring a drink to a table. Some of you might have been told that if it's a singular drink, you can bring that one drink by hand to a table. Some of you might have been told that you can just take drinks to the table by hand and you don't need to use a tray, right? None of those are right or wrong. They're just different ways of doing things. And ultimately, there's no right or wrong way of doing anything. But what we do want to find is a singular way that we all operate inside the space, so that whether someone is sitting over in that far corner over here or on the opposite side of the restaurant, every time that they come in, they get a universal experience. They don't get a differing one time to time to time. It's not that one person's methods are better or worse than anyone else's. It's just that ultimately we have to pick a lane in order to make sure that we are executing universally and consistently, because inconsistency is what turns people off from becoming regulars inside a setting, okay? So that being said, this time period that's defined, and today is a little bit on the spectrum of you're walking in unaware of what the next conversation is going to be in the next conversation. As Carrie has alluded to, every single day moving forward, we'll be going through a recap of what the next day's worth of work looks like, so that you have eyes on it, because I can tell you, I don't like surprises and I don't like being blindsided on anything. And my assumption is that many of you don't, and you like to know what the path is in front of you. And so the goal will be, as we get to know each other better, you'll have 100% clarity as to what the next day is going to unfold, okay? So this conversation that we're having is a conversation that I like to have with everyone. And you may ask, right? Because this conversation is going to be on service and hospitality. Why is it inclusive of both front of the house and back of the house? Okay? So, the reason why, first of all, I'll continue with my reason why. I think circularly, so I'll get off track every once in a while, and you'll need to nudge me every once in a while if I don't follow through and get back to the finish line with you. I've never been a very linear person, as Chris knows all too well from having to go through many rambling conversations. The reason why we do this is because of the fact that often culinary employees are excluded from the full conversation of what is meant to occur overall in the product that we present to people who come into the space, right? And there's not one group of people who are better or worse at championing that overall experience. There's typically a lack of exposure from people who work inside the kitchen at being able to understand what the full and totality of everything that we're doing is, which puts them at a deficit of learning and education. Because what I will say, and this is my personal story, I started in restaurants in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is my hometown, while I was going to school for political science, which sounds at this day and age like the worst possible career choice that could occur. So I'm very thankful that I got diverted from it. But as I was going through, I was like probably many people in this room, I was not funded by anybody else. And so I had full-time jobs at all times from the time that I could have a full-time job in order to support myself, right? It happened to be that I did so in restaurants. And inside restaurants, I very quickly went to what at that time was considered to be a fine dining restaurant. And I enjoyed working multiple positions. So I would do, let's say, Fridays and Saturdays as a host on the door. I would work, some days as what would be considered now a busser position. I would serve some days. For me, I just like being exposed to a lot of different things. And so I subsequently stayed with the roles as I kept on being offered more and more responsibilities. In the end, I ended up choosing to stay in hospitality as opposed to going on and advancing what I had been studying for, right? I managed to work through some mid-sized groups to opening singular spaces for independent chefs. And then probably when I was maybe 3 years into my career, I ended up having a chef who I connected with a lot, who sat down with me, and he had just returned from New York City to Ann Arbor. And he said to me that you were never really of this industry until you've worked in one of the big 3 cities. And at that point, which was very different, which again, I will allude to my age, but I will not tell you my age. There was no Food Network. There was none of these sort of regional advances, the movement of food as a profession didn't exist really outside of San Francisco, Chicago, and New York at that point in the United States, as far as I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna do this for the rest of my life, okay? And so I ended up moving to New York, and I worked for a chef in New York who had attained a certain amount of success. His name was Jean-Georges Vondrushin. And I worked with him for about 14 years in multiple spaces, opening a lot of spaces, and being a participant in helping to grow the amount of footprint that he had globally. And at a certain point, after I had worked for him for those 14 years, and I had referenced this a little bit earlier when I introduced our team, I had a birthday, which is often, for those of you who are in this room, sometimes where we take stock of our lives and where they've gone and where they're going in the future. And I looked and I was like, if I stay another year with this company, I'll stay 10 years. And then will I have the desire to do something that's independent, to help participate in growing something, creating something? And for me, I was uninterested in staying with a company that had its bones built in the 80s. That didn't mean that it was a bad company. That didn't mean that my ideas of how things should be done differently were right or correct. It just meant that I wanted the opportunity to try and help create a culture that felt a little bit more progressive. And so I left. I went to hotels for quite a bit. For 1 year, traveling throughout the US, opening hotels for a group called Aperium. And then I was with a group called Lore Group for about 3.5, close to 4 years, where I was based in New York, and then I moved to London with the idea that we were opening independent hotels in landmark buildings, ones that were considered historic structures in major city centers. At that point, the spaces that we were operating in were Washington, D.C., Amsterdam, and in London. And so suffice it to say, what I would say is, in my career, and then moving to Portland, none of these things, if you were looking at a linear trajectory, on paper would make sense, right? You might find somebody who just chose to put their head down and continue moving through the rungs at one of those singular restaurant groups that I was at when I first started in the industry, or maybe progressing through the American Midwest, staying in Ann Arbor, and then growing from there. Moving to New York would have been kind of a pivot. Being in New York for so long was certainly a pivot. Changing to hotels was a pivot. Moving to London was a pivot. And then coming back and then moving to the States and then moving to Portland, Maine was a pivot from all of those things. What I often give is people as advice as they're going through their careers inside this industry is to allow yourself to veer in unexpected directions, because you can never be sure of where the next step is going to take you. And ultimately, it allows you to be able to be open to growth in whatever way looks best for you, as opposed to it looking like the ladder that a lot of people are searching for, that feels very regimented, rigid, and feels like it's easy to measure what that next linear stage of growth is for you. For me, exposure, learning, education have always been driving forces in why I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And that might have been even working at a 75-seat restaurant with a chef, where we're opening a space near Detroit that, has no backing, has no name accorded to it. And it might have been leading a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant in New York City. All of those things, to me, are parts of the same. One is not better than the other. They're different experiences, right? So you're coming into this, and that also informs what I was saying with culinary and with front of the house. You cannot predict where your ultimate, if you stay with the industry, right, desire for growth might take you. And it could take you to stay in the roles or in the path that you're in, or it could take you in other different spaces, right? And so the idea should be that those of us who are here leading this process are giving you as much exposure as possible, so that you have the knowledge to then be able to decide how you choose to better yourself and where you choose to better yourself. And to elaborate on that point, no one in this room, whether it is front of the house who is directly interacting with guests, or it is back of the house who is preparing the food that goes in front of those guests, right? No one is more guest focused than any other position. They're just taking care of, as we said before, a different division of responsibilities to add to the sum of the total, all right? So if you think of it that way, then it becomes a little bit less confusing about why our conversations at the beginning of this process will be global and comprehensive of everyone, not excluding anyone as part of this conversation, okay? We, meaning PHG, which is the organization that is bringing Duro to life, have some things that we have defined as being important to us, right? Pillars, if you will, right? One of those is a culinary lens. So I came from a background where most of the spaces that I have led have been driven by chefs, and the priority being the food, and the food having a technical expertise that is employed, that is the driving factor. In other spaces, which are not better or worse than the ones that I've worked in, you could have a restaurateur who comes up with the space, comes up with a concept, and then ultimately comes up with a menu, and then hires a chef to execute that menu. That's just simply not the house that I've grown in, nor the house that Colin has grown in, nor Georgia Macon, who you'll meet with. And so a lot of us at the group level here, our priorities are focusing that there is a food focus first, and that our focus is making sure that there is a culinary credibility, and everything else will flow out from there. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so that's one. Two, our second piece that I would outline would be that there's a sense of place, right? So that sense of place for us is Portland, Maine. You'll hear a bit about this concept and how we got to it tomorrow. Much of how we got to it is by considering how it sits inside Portland and how it relates to it. So that might sound odd to hear when you hear that you're sitting inside a Portuguese-inspired restaurant, but there's a logic behind it that will be explained. But that logic helped to define it as being Portuguese-inspired, and was a directional compass for us in creating what the space wanted to be, okay? So we're never going to walk into a space and shove design into it because we've fallen in love with design, we will create a space that is tailored to what that physical location might want to be. And that speaks to part of the fact that our overall parent company is a real estate development company. And so that informs how we look at spaces, right? So that they're legitimate and they're not just shoved into whatever space we were able to find. Does that make sense to everybody? So we say a culinary lens and a sense of place. Those make sense. Typically, in Feng Shui, odd numbers are superior to evens. So we have one more lens, or one more pattern, or pillar, sorry, that we use as our totem. And that is modern hospitality, classic values, okay? Classic values does not mean a conservative approach to things. It means a look back, and we'll go into a bit of this in a second, at the historical behind why we do things. So from a service perspective, which we'll go into, there is a historical lineage that goes centuries back. And the idea behind that is caretaking, right? It is what we do for people inside this space and many others like them, is we play into the idea that we are hosting people well, all right? We are not creating a public library. We are not educating them about some particular subject matter as you would in a university. We're not fighting a legal battle inside this room. What we are is, this is a space that's meant to be about enjoyment. It's about pleasure, and for us, we can't lose sight of that. Our responsibility in that is nurturing skills, caretaking, and thinking of the people who are sitting at the table first, right? That doesn't mean that we don't value ourselves or our team. It just means that in our minds, our North Star is making sure that people leave feeling well cared for. Does that make sense? So that is a classic value system, right? And not classic as in like 50 years old, but classic as in like 500 years old, all right? Does that make sense? Okay. And modern hospitality means, so not to contradict a dear friend of mine who was speaking earlier, Colleen, but I will tell you that very rarely will I allow you to speak off of a script. Because when I first started in hospitality, you had to speak in a script. There was a rigid box. It was a menu presentation that had to appear just so, and you had to hit all the notes, and typically they wanted you to hit them word for word, right? Now, words might sound authentic in my voice and might sound incredibly inauthentic in your voice if they are the exact same words. The goal with modern hospitality is to bring your personality and who you are as a person into the equation in order for there to be a genuineness in which people are able to connect with things, as opposed to it being artificial and transactional. Does that make sense? So that's where the modern type of it goes. Also, we are not fine dining, right? That word is almost, and you can talk to Colin about this because we have similar viewpoints, it's almost a 4-letter word now at this point. We want people to feel like we are putting craftsmanship into what we do, but we want the experience to be informal, we want it to be fun, and we want people to enjoy themselves, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? There's a few other things that are important to us, and those are values that we think are important that I should outline. You know, one is that we are inclusive, right? So the idea being that we are really doing our best to make sure that the space adapts itself for anyone. So an example of this might be when you look at the menu, you will find that if you were to come in with any number of dietary restrictions, you would be able to find a space for yourself, right? Because we're not ranking and saying that the person who most fits in line with what the concept is, deserves a proper meal. We're saying that we want everyone to be able to feel comfortable coming into the space. And so we need to think about all of their needs so that they can all be able to dine here, okay? So that's one value system. A second value system would be timeless. This space is meant to be energetic, it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be not serious. You see tall counters that represent the Iberian Peninsula. I'm gonna shut up now because I don't wanna go into a lot of different things that part of the design conversation that we'll have later. But ultimately, it is not meant to be overly formal, okay? And for a reason, right? However, you can be cool and 20, or you can be cool and 75, right? Our goal is to be able to cater to any number of those people. So we're not just catering to a useful demographic where they singularly can enjoy this space, and we're trying to be the hottest thing out there. Ultimately, when you try and chase that, you ultimately give yourself a timeline where you're relevant. For us, the most important thing is that any different group feels comfortable inside this space and being well hosted here, okay? Then we go into expert. This is the third value that is important to us. I would turn to any number of the people who sit on your management team, whether it's Aaron or Jim or Joe or any of the other people who've been hired for us. We have chosen people who represent a certain expertise. And to pull this back to Culinary Lens, our focal point is on executing even things that seem simple in a beautiful and clear way, which often is very difficult, right? And so ultimately, expertise is something that drives what we're looking to do. Does that make sense to everyone? So those three values are incredibly important to us. A fourth value that we are invested in is making sure that we are all dynamically engaged in the space so that everyone here understands exactly what's going on, as we talked about before. The goal for all of us inside the space is to make you each individually experts, okay? Whether you're here on a Tuesday, here on a Wednesday, or here on a Thursday, the space doesn't work if it only works when certain people are present. So ultimately, all of us who are inside this room and anybody who later joins the team need to feel like they have access to all information and that it's free to them, okay? So that's a bit of information about what our core value system is as a group that plays itself out inside this space. Does that make sense to everybody who's here? And I think values are important to talk about because values are important for you to decide that you align with our values and for you to understand who we are and what we think is important on day one, as well as it will be on day 50, okay? Now, service and hospitality. So I had mentioned a couple, when I was rambling earlier about the fact that I was not that person who heard something from somebody who was leading me until I did something for the 100th time. And then I would hear, don't do this or do this, right? And I mentioned also that the weakest level of leadership is you do this because I said you do it. Our job is to convey to you the why something is done. And in almost every single piece of the puzzle, there is a reason that's rooted in either efficiency or there is a reason that's rooted in etiquette, right? And both of those things have real reasonings as to why they were chosen. One, when we hear the word etiquette, it sounds like a bad word. Really what etiquette was meant to do, it's a series of protocols to make people feel at ease. It's not as complicated as it sounds or as people have made it out to be in this day and age. So ultimately, that is meant to be the humanist side of things. Efficiency is so that you guys don't end up falling on your face every single time you walk out of this space because you're exhausted, right? So there are routes that we've chosen, and our job is to educate you as to why those routes are as we go forward, so that you feel comfortable with them, okay? Service and hospitality are used interchangeably to describe our industry, right? Many people, I'm sure everybody here, raise your hand if you've heard what we kind of do described as the service industry. Raise your hand. You don't have to be nervous. I can't see all your hands, so if you feel uncomfortable with your hand going up, you don't need to have it go up. On the flip side of that, who here has heard it referred to as the hospitality industry? Raise your hand, okay? So it's important that we define for you what these words mean to us. They don't mean that they're the technical textbook Webster's definition of what the words mean. It just means that this is what these mean for us, okay? Service is a series of steps that need to occur in order for a need to be met, okay? That end goal, that end need could be you purchasing a cell phone at a Verizon store. It could be you checking out your groceries at the grocery store, right? And going home with food for the week. It could be you going into a bank and taking care of some transaction that's necessary for you. All of those things, there is a need that you have, and there are some things that need to occur in order for that need to be completed, right? Many of which sit outside of your control and sit in whoever's executing that task, right? So for example, a way that this would play itself out for us is that, let's say someone comes into this restaurant and orders a bottle of wine. Until we set a wine glass on the table, we can't pour the wine for them, right? So there are literally things that have to happen in order for A to become B, right? So if that makes sense, it's for us it's not that it is absent of importance, it just is very clear that there is clear steps, logical steps that have to occur, right? Hospitality is a separate situation. Hospitality, for us, there is a genuineness, a warmth, a human engagement that occurs inside a hospitality setting, right? That is less quantifiable than setting the glass down on the table, but no less important, right? And so what we're always going to do in everything that we do inside this establishment, and we'll go through a lot of that as we start to progress this training, is we're going to try to combine those service points with hospitality and engagement so that people feel like they are well cared for at the end of the day, and it's not simply about that need being met singularly, okay? So, and how can sometimes a great or good service occur without there being a human component or a hospitality delivered? I'll give you an example, okay? All of you just signed on to this space. That will translate into you getting paychecks. Many of you will sign up for direct deposit. Some of you, well, hopefully nobody, sorry, Colleen, might have a challenge or time that lags between when the payroll is processed and your bank adopting direct deposit, right? And so that might mean that one or two of you has a physical copy of the check, and maybe the app in your phone is down and you can't load it up separately from that. So there's a need for you to physically go to that bank branch to be able to cash that check or deposit that check, okay? Paydays, like most spaces, happen here at the end of the work week, right? Which is basically that you're receiving them on Friday, right? So if Friday is in America more or less a universal payday, right? It means that the majority of bank transactions that are personal and not professional are occurring on those Fridays, right? So let's say Natalie here, keep on using her as the example, receives her paycheck and she has to physically go to a bank branch to cash it on a Friday. So she mentally gears herself up for the fact that probably the bank is going to be understaffed. It might take a long time to get out of that bank and to be able to make sure that this task is accomplished. So she walks in with a fairly pessimistic point of view, and she's just hoping to be able that this gets accomplished as quickly as possible. So Natalie walks up to the bank, and every teller window is open, and the line progresses quickly and efficiently, and she walks out of there with within a fraction of the time that she had in her mind set aside for cashing or depositing that check. Did she receive good service? It's not a trick question, I promise. Yes, because they exceeded her expectations, right? That's many of you have heard this over and over again. Our goal is to exceed expectations. That's what service can do, right? Because there's a measurable goal, right? With service, we know what the end result is, so you can exceed those points of that to be able to provide a greater result for whoever is receiving, right? What I did not describe, despite the fact that we've said that that is great service, is anything that was remotely connected to a person or people or the way that she might feel walking out of this scenario, right? And so in our work, we are looking to take the experience and make it personal, okay? So years ago, so we have 3 weeks of training, right? You go to a lot of different restaurants inside Portland or any other space across the world, right? And you might find yourself having 5 to 7 days of training, and each day might have an end goal, right? So it might be that you're following one day, you start to accomplish tasks day 2, day 3, you're getting the handover and you're starting to do more. Day 4, whoever's with you is following you a bit more to make sure that you're getting the workflow down, and so on and so forth, right? That training idea was created by a lot of the places where people don't place a lot of respect nowadays. So a lot of your chain restaurants that came up in the 60s and 70s are the spaces who created the core training philosophies and investment in people that we now utilize today. Because before then, right, you had a lot of singular restaurants that were often mom and pops, right? That's what they're referred to as, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively, right? And when you are running a singular space and your goal is just running successful shifts, you don't necessarily have enough time to stop and think about how you're doing things because you're so much in the process, right? So these spaces that had aspirations or ideas to grow on a larger scale, right? At that point, the world was very much looking for formulaic. It's very different than it is today, where people are looking for experiences. Back then, the reason why chain restaurants proliferated or were appealing is that if you were someone out there who was going out on the road or on a trip, you could know that you were walking into the same sort of experience. You could count on the quality and what it represented, so there were less unknowns. So it was actually a desirable thing at that point because of the fact that it allowed you to be able to have a path that felt well-trodden, all right? So what happened in order to replicate those spaces over and over in different locations, farther away, is you had to have conversations about how you would train these principles whether they were based in how to execute food or based in how to serve that food, right? That would allow, whether I was going into a space in Ohio or in Florida, for those spaces to feel similar to one another, right? And so then became the conversations about classroom settings, about how we're educating people, about what we're doing. So a lot of what we owe is actually due to those restaurants, right? As much as they are not given so much respect these days, they did set a path for there to be a greater conversation about the individual. During that time period, one of the things that changed was this idea of referring in a hospitality setting to a customer as not a customer or a client, but as a guest, right? And the idea was that it would evoke emotion with the person who was taking care of them so that they felt more personally engaged with that individual as opposed to it feeling like it was transactional, right? And so one of the things that a guest leads us to, right, because we're talking about hospitality, is what exactly hosting skills mean, okay? So many of us in this room probably have heard the word host, and we tie it to somebody who works at a stand like that, who seats people at a table, all right? For us, I'd like to pull it way further back because hosting is something that was always tied towards service and caretaking and had nothing to do with a singular role or position, but instead was tied to how someone felt about an overall experience. So hosting skills were the level of investment that we had in how someone walked away from an experience, okay? So that would be, for example, let's say one of you chooses to go to Gregory's house for a holiday party and you're new to Portland, okay? You come in, you don't know the rest of the team that he works with, right? Let's say you two have met each other at work. You're like a week or two into the experience. And so you're still getting your footing and understanding names, etc. And Gregory is hosting people there, and he's kindly invited you to make you feel like you're welcomed as part of the team. So when he invites you over, right, he's gonna meet you at the door, see that you're there, take your coat, show you his apartment, guide you to where the food is, guide you to where the drinks are. He might introduce you to a few people and get a drink in your hand while you're having a conversation with the people in that room. And then as he's then focusing on the rest of the people in that room, making sure that there's enough food, there's enough drinks, that people are well cared for, he's gonna have his eye on you on the periphery for when you are outside of conversations and standing alone inside the room, or when your drink might be empty, or when it might seem that you feel uncomfortable. And he'll either guide you to a conversation with a different group of people, or he'll top off your drink. And because of the fact that in Gregory's world, right, how you walk away from that party is how you view him, right? The level of care that you faced and how comfortable you were and whether you had a good time reflects on him. And I think most people in this room can think of, no matter how big or how small the experience might have been, a singular situation in which you cared about how people walked away from that experience feeling, right? Could have been your parents the first time hosting them in a space that was your own. Could have been friends the first time that you were able to afford to pull together an event for them. Could have been taking somebody out to dinner for the first time. There's a number of different ways that these can play themselves out, but ultimately, I think we can all universally think about how good it feels to be able to give somebody else an experience, right? That is what we do on a daily basis inside this space. And so that level of investment in the end result or how somebody walks away is important to all of us. And it also opens up a secondary conversation, which is that, when I first started in this industry, the customer was that stupid saying was actually used, which is the customer is always right, to the detriment of people who are working in establishments often. I can remember being in spaces until 6 a.m. while people were finishing up their meal because I couldn't ask them to leave. I can remember people who displayed abusive behavior inside a setting and having to protect my teams from engaging and interacting with them because I didn't trust that whoever I was working for would support me if I were to throw them out, right? That has changed. As many of us have grown in the industry, we have different standards for what we would find acceptable for people below us, as we've been more empowered, right? And what I would say is, however, is that one of the things that I liked that I took away from that was not the negatives of the experience, but understanding how my viewpoint wasn't the most important. When I was in scenarios where I had to be there regardless of whether a guest was leaving at a certain time or whether I was able to close doors when I wanted to, it became irrelevant what I thought of it. So I didn't really put as much effort into that. Or, when you're in a situation in which you're told like the guest is always right, I might not be so quick to judge whether they get a well-done steak or whether they have ketchup with said steak. But because in the end, what does it matter, right? So I think the thing that we can take from that is not taking the negatives of it, but understanding that our personal projections onto somebody else are not important in the scheme of things. Ultimately, the most important thing is that somebody walks away happy, and their version of happy is different than your version of happy, right? Because they're a different human who occupies a different body than the one that you're sitting in, right? So our goal is kind of a bit more complicated in that we are trying to channel what somebody else might want from the experience. So sometimes the separation of yourself and your judgment is helpful in those settings. I know how challenging it can be, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the day when we talk about emotional intelligence. But when you're immediately hit with negative energy or negative feedback, it's impossible for any of us to divorce ourselves from the fact that we have a reaction to that, right? Which is almost always defensive. It's natural, right? We're humans, we're built on fight or flight emotions, right? And so we're going to protect ourselves by saying, this is the reason why we're right, and this is the reason why they're wrong. What I would have found as I've gotten more mature and gone through more therapy in life is that oftentimes those people who are holding up a mirror and telling you the negatives are pointing out where you're falling short of your own standards, right? So sometimes when we lose what somebody's saying because of how they're saying it, we're not taking the educational points that are there. Now we can reject the behavior if it crosses certain lines, but I think it's still important that we understand being able to pull aside the information that's necessary in order for us to be better tomorrow than we are today, right? And to that end, a guest who comes inside this space once we're active and open could hate the decor. They could dislike the music. They could dislike the beverages that they're served. They could dislike the food that goes in front of them, right, and on their plate. Those are things that are subjective, right, that we can't control how someone else receives. What we can control is how gracious and how kind we are to someone. And what I would say to you is that my goal for each and everybody inside this room is that even if somebody were to walk out and to write a scathing review of us or write a letter complaining about the space, that at the end of it, they noted that everybody was kind and tried to take care of them. If we accomplish that little, we've done our jobs. regardless of how somebody interprets the experience overall. So it's important to understand why hospitality is so important, because it's how people walk away with feeling that we're invested in the end result. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Is everybody still here? Anybody bored, asleep, going into like a conversation with yourself about what tomorrow you have to do or what time you have to get home today? Because I recognize that sometimes it's difficult in these. We get itchy about hearing conversations for a long period of time. Okay. So tomorrow, I'll go through some things globally about the experience now that we will go into more detail on tomorrow when we'll go through a service seminar, which will go through specific touch points. But one of the things that I'd like to talk about is what happens when a guest walks into a space to when they leave, right? And how we affect that, or how our overall presence affects that. So, and this is a lesson that we all have to learn, is placing ourselves inside the seat of the person who is in front of you, right? So when somebody first walks into a space, right, it's one of two times that, in my humble opinion, are the most uncomfortable for a guest, because it is a space in which they lack orientation, right? They might not know whether you need a reservation for the space. They might not know whether you can walk into the space. There's many different questions that are there. And I think that all of us can universally say that there's probably, I always feel like it's in a strip mall for some reason, but there's generally a space that's smaller, that has all of the same things that we have here, just on a smaller level, of a bar, a host stand, tables of some sort, right? And I know I have walked into a space like this where you walk in and you don't see anyone. The door is open, but you don't see anyone and you're not sure what to do. How many of you can say that you've walked into a space like that? So there's all these questions in your head. Do I seat myself? Do I stand here and wait? Are they really open? Is no one here? There's all of these things that lead to awkward and uncomfortable spaces for somebody who's in the role of trying to approach in that business. And for us, that is something that we're always trying to fill in the gaps for, is to allow somebody to have points of orientation so they feel more comfortable with the process, which is the reason why hosts exist. It is not simply to walk someone and be a body to take them to a table. It is to orient them. You are their point person. You are the first defense in making somebody feel comfortable, right? And so it is being attuned to the fact that when somebody walks in, they can encounter a couple of different things. They could encounter no one at the host stand and everybody ignoring them. They could encounter someone standing at the host stand and looking down at an iPad and planning out their night in technology, right? That happens. And it's not because somebody's trying to do wrong. Oftentimes, the things that we do that are against the guest's better experience are simply because of the fact that we lack awareness for the fact that we're lost in a task, right? And not seeing the picture as a whole. Ultimately, our job, if we are manning a host stand, right, and leading that part of the experience, is to engage with somebody so that at first, when you're first walking into a space, you feel like you are welcomed. There's no gap in you having to interpret how you have to engage with the space, and that you start to get ushered into the direction that you need to go. I want to come in for drinks. I want to come in as a walk-in. I want to come in as a reservation. I'm here for lunch. I'm here for dinner. There is somebody who can then guide that person into what the next step is in the process, regardless of what it is, right? And so it's why somebody is leading that door experience, because they are the first voice and they are the first impression of the restaurant, not simply so that they can walk to the table that they've been assigned for the night. Does that make sense to everybody who's here? Okay. So a guest walks in, they're greeted by somebody at that front door, and there's a couple of different options we have. So when we think about how things are done, I told you before, efficiency or etiquette, right, there's also this idea of, if we pull it back to service and hospitality, subbing in for those two words, right? There's function and form. So function is, I need to do this in order to get from point A to point B, right? Form is, I'm doing it this way so that there's an impression that's positive from this experience, right? So, who here has walked into a space where the first question that you're asked is, do you have a reservation? Okay. What might be negative about that question? So elitist, it might feel like it also puts you at odds with the person who's there. So like, either you're to further distill, and tell me if I'm getting it right, you're either on the team and you have a reservation, or you're not on the team and you don't have a reservation, which means that you're not one of us, right? Exactly. So in a certain way, what that says to us is a gatekeeper mentality, which is that you're here, or if you don't have this, you're not. I can express to you this. I've been in the industry many years, not saying how many they are. Thanks, Joe. And what I can tell you is that being in the industry, I think it makes us even lazier about making reservations, right? Added to the fact that who here in your neighborhood thinks of making reservations at the local restaurant that sits in your neighborhood? Does anybody here? I don't. I think that I can just walk in, right? So if we take that more globally, years ago when I used to run a door, and I'm being honest about how I thought, because there are a lot of criticisms that I would give early on, I used to think when I was running a door and someone would come in as a walk-in, I would think, amazing. I've been trying to figure out who's going to sit next to the restroom tonight. And I think they came in, so they don't have any legs that they can stand on. They're getting the worst table in the house, right? My perspective has changed over the years in that your true locals, you can see it particularly in Portland, right? We try and not allow the booking window at our restaurants to be too great, because if we open up the booking window too far in advance, it caters solely to people who are outside of Portland. It caters solely to tourists and to transient guests and excludes people who are locals. So a lot of times what we'll say is we have a month-long booking window that gets us closer to being able to cater, right, to the people who actually live inside the city, right? In general, your locals will not make plans in advance. If you're traveling and you're going to Paris, or you're going to New York, or you're going to Mexico City, you're probably going to make reservations because you just don't know how those cities work yet. And so yes, you'll make that extension, right? But living inside Portland, you're probably not going to make the same sort of effort or put the same sort of energy to planning an itinerary to yourself, and you'll wind down closer towards the day of, and then figure out exactly how you can move forward. So what I would say is, right, a lot of your walk-ins are actually your locals. They're people who live in a neighborhood, who don't assume that they need to have a reservation, who haven't had the bandwidth because they've had a busy week or a lot of responsibilities or things going on to make plans for that Friday or Saturday or Sunday or Monday evening. And so when they walk in, I value them even more because there's the potential that they are the local, right? They're the person who will come here off season as well as in season. And so it is important to give them, for me, a better table as opposed to a worse table, right? The same is true of single dining guests. Years ago, I did not put much thought into single diners who are going out. But when you think of the fact that oftentimes we as humans feel uncomfortable and exposed when we're alone, right? Dining out as a single person is a luxury that a lot of people will not make for themselves. It takes effort, it takes energy. It means that you're on display of a group of people. A lot of people will never feel comfortable with that process. So with that, somebody who is dining alone and is treating themselves when they could easily sit at home or wait for Uber Eats, right? To me, or to us rather, they should feel even more important, right? Because of the fact that we should prioritize them, because that is something that not everybody in the population will choose to do, right? So it's things like this that invert our thought process in how we engage with people. Does that make sense? Okay. So this guest, whomever I'm talking about, walks in through the front door and engages at the front host stand. And there's a number of different ways that I can engage with this guest as opposed to going into a transactional, did you have a reservation, right? I need to find out what that information is because of the fact that if they have a reservation, there's a different process than if they don't have a reservation. But the first thing that I'm going to do is to treat them as a human being. And I think it's important to think of all of this because in all of our brains, and you find it at the shoulder, who here has worked in restaurants before? Raise your hand. Okay, so most of you, so I can say that. Who here has worked at the end of a service when your brain is fried and you go towards polishing glassware or silverware and you just zone out, right? Or you're in the back and you're doing prep work and your brain is just going nowhere outside of where your body is, right? It's because singular repetitive tasks are very comforting for us. So that's also the reason why one of the dangerous periods in restaurants is periods that we start to taper off, but we still have guests in, and we have the responsibility of closing them down, not because anybody is trying to do harm, but because of the fact that we're having to choose between the guests that still exist while tasks need to be completed. And we could drift into those tasks, and that task could then numb us into 15 minutes of losing sight of where we are and what's going on, right? Because it's easy, it's comfortable, it is meditative, right? So for us, it's important to recognize that when somebody comes in, we want to camouflage that and go away from the transactional into the personal. So it becomes a series of questions or greetings that looks entirely different, which it could be, hello, how are you today? Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you, right? All of these things can be an initial reaction. And I, at the front door, am always going to be moving the grid around, paying attention to what reservations sit inside the reservations platform. But my goal is to always have on my periphery an awareness of when that door is opening or when there's a shadow in front of me so I can look up and prioritize the person in front of me versus a transactional task that's in front of me, right? Which is very easy to drift into those transactional tasks. I can tell you for, let's say, many more years than I would like, I have not been tied to a singular space, and I've been in multiple spaces. And I will walk into those spaces on, let's say, a Friday or a Saturday or a whatever evening, right? And I might immediately see a guest who's looking for someone to make eye contact with them. And the reason why I'm able to see that is because everything hasn't become wallpaper for me, and I haven't been inside the space. So I'm looking at the room and looking at faces as well as at what's going on. Whereas what happens for the individual workers who are not less capable, less intelligent, less aware than I am, is that they can drift towards those tasks that we said before and start to get tunnel vision. So I'm looking not at the people that I'm walking past and their eye contact, but I'm looking at the bar and whether it's produced my drinks, or I'm looking at the side station to see whether somebody's freed up the terminal so that I can ring in whatever I need done. There's a whole host of things where it can be easy for us to get lost in that. So a lot of our fight is going to be globally for us to think about ways that we as a group cannot get trapped in tasks that always be focused on the guests who come into the space. Does that make sense? Okay. So when that person comes in, my goal is to engage with them like a human, because there are often times we go into these autopilot roles. For example, when I'm a host and I seat somebody at a table, years ago, it drives me nuts because there's these. Has anybody ever been into a restaurant? This is when it's going to seem like I'm shitting on chain restaurants. Sorry, guys. I can't use another example. Let's say you've gone to a chain restaurant and you come in and there's a manager and they come up to your table and they say, "How is everything?" Right? And there's literally no time that's spent looking you in the eye and waiting for your response before they start to walk away from the table, right? And then you might be able to see them go to the table next to you and ask them the same thing. So what they've been told is that they have to talk to every single table in the room. And so they are doing what was asked of them. They're just not approaching it from looking at people and how they will process it. Because if I'm sitting at a table and you've asked me how something is, but you're starting to walk away from me as I'm answering, that to me does not signal that you're invested in the answer, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that there are times that we go into autopilot. One of them that always drove me nuts, because I've always had an affinity for hosts, hey, we're gonna have a good time, is that ultimately, whenever I would have these great hosts, they would seat people and they would have been told in other establishments that they had to say something to someone before they left, right? And so they would say a single word to try and get away from that table because they were done with those guests. And it would always be enjoy, which drove me nuts because living most of my life in New York, I do tend to be a neurotic, pessimistic New Yorker. And so in my mind, I would think, enjoy what? The table, the sky? What are we saying here? Like, to be specific about what you're talking about, right? And so in this circumstance, what I would say is that person has been told, you need to say something to a guest before you walk away from them. Whereas what I would say is, if that one thing that you're saying feels inauthentic, I would rather that you just walked away from that human being. Because to me, that's being more successful than it just looking like you're phoning in something, right? So it's you using your problem-solving skills into discerning, yes, I might have been told this, but if I'm not adding to the experience, then I don't need to go along with it. And this will be something that I bring up with emotional intelligence, which is, are you adding or are you subtracting from that overall guest experience, okay? So what I have told people over and over again is, let's say you're the guest, or let's say you're the food runner who's dropping off food, or somebody who's dropping drinks. If people are talking and they're chatting and they're enjoying themselves, you don't need to say anything. You can just let them be, right? Has anybody ever walked into a space? I feel bad because maybe it'll have happened at one of our restaurants, right? Hopefully not. But where somebody has been told, okay, we're gonna call out every plate that's at the table. So when I'm dropping food, I'm gonna introduce the dish. I have dined at a lot of spaces because I am what I would affectionately call chatty with people that I like, right? I have been interrupted by somebody who's dropping off plates, talking over me, because of the fact that they've been told that they have to introduce every single plate to the table, as opposed to allowing me to just focus in on it, right? And, hey-yo. And so ultimately, one of the things that I think is important is that we recognize that if those guests are talking, we don't need to interrupt them. We can just walk away. And there come a time where we can tell them what's occurring on the table, but everything that you've been told gets scrapped in favor of the individual humans that are in front of you and adapting to them. Does that make sense? Right? If not, then what I would say to that host who's showing somebody to a table is speaking in a full and complete sentence. So saying, I hope you have a lovely afternoon. I hope you enjoy your birthday. I hope you have a great lunch. I hope you enjoy your dinner. Whatever it might be, speak in a full and complete sentence to those guests in the way that's relevant to them. Does that make sense? Okay, so I like to keep myself on time. Okay, great. That is what I'd like us to take away from things, is that you're going to be getting, as we go into this in greater depth, those series of steps. And at any point, you also have a judgment call to make, which is taking care of the guests, which supersedes those steps being handled in the way that you've been trained, right? If somebody is left-handed and they constantly are moving an item from one side of the table to the opposite side of the table, you can reserve the right to be able to flip that the next time you reset that table so that they don't have to go to that effort, right? That's an example of how we can look at something and not just do it simply as we've been told if we're observing the people who are in front of us, right? So it's adjusting and tailoring to those people who are taking care of us. Does this make sense? Okay. I feel like this is the time for pointed questions, because if I say, does anybody have any questions on day one, not one of you will answer because of the fact that it's uncomfortable for anybody to ask a question. So one of the things that you'll find throughout this training process is that we will go through different scenarios, situations, and we will, let's say one of you does something in a way in which there's something to teach, right? It could be setting down a drink, it could be spilling something, it could be dropping something. What I will tell you is that in our spaces, we pay people to make mistakes. This is a lecture that I give to every manager who joins our teams. We pay people to make mistakes, okay? Throughout this process, this training process, you're going to make mistakes. And they will be different than the mistakes that we could predict for you, and they will be different from one another, right? If somebody inside a restaurant goes from being a busser to being promoted to a server, they will make mistakes and they will cost the restaurant money. If there is somebody who goes from being a dishwasher to being a prep cook, they will make mistakes that will cost the restaurant money. And that same thing goes through each rung of the ladder. Every single human who's here will make mistakes, myself included, right? So we can't be afraid of mistakes. When those mistakes occur, chances are you singly would not be the only person who would make that mistake. It's also something that probably everybody else in the room could learn from. So what you'll find inside the kitchen or inside the dining room is that we will call time and we will say, if everyone could look over here, there's a scenario that came up that could happen to anyone, right? Not that one person. It's not built upon shaming or profiling any individual here. It's built upon the fact that different scenarios are playing themselves out around the room, and you should be able to learn from you, and you should be able to learn from you, and so on and so forth, right? We're here to make controlled mistakes where we know that there's no punishment until we all feel much more confident and comfortable. Because the reality of the scenario is that regardless of where you sit on a schedule, whether you're a bartender, whether you're a server, whether you're a host, whether you're a line cook, whether you're a prep cook, whether you're a manager, right? Nothing will be real inside this space until we do it collectively. They say, I don't know, science says this, whether it's real or not, I can't tell you because I haven't done the studies myself, that it takes a month or close to 30 days of executing tasks repetitively for them to feel like we know them like the back of our hands. So keep in mind, for your managers, this space will not be real until a month of us opening. It won't be real for any of us. And what I will say is we will open this space with a certain intention, and then humans will use it as guests. And that might inform menu decisions that we make, that might inform how we change service steps, etc. The one thing that I think you had heard earlier in my conversation was that I did not want to participate in a group that had been around for a long period of time, that had a logical structure that worked for it, that was very successful, because I wanted to help build something. What I think is important that everyone here, which is something that Carrie tied herself to before, is that we should never allow ourselves to go into a space of, this is the way that we've always done something, right? It is a drain on creativity. It is a drain on potential for us to fall back into the way that we've done things. So we all need to be open to the future. But what I would say, getting back to my original part, I told you that I thought circularly, is that all of us in this room, will not be consistently owning this as we would and understanding it until we've done it from being open for a month. Not just training, but open for a month. So we all need to be open to the process, to working together, to collaborating, to seeing the best way to do things, and to listening to one another to come to the best end result of the product, okay? And so that, I would say, is incredibly important for us, and you'll hear it over and over again. We need to be open and open-minded. Does that make sense? Okay. So that being said, we're getting into a space where we're probably going to take a little bit of a break for lunch. What's my name? Dallas. Okay. I'm going to ask a couple of things, and if I call on you, please don't be upset about me. I will do my best to remember faces, not call on you again, and put somebody else on the spot. But I'm just going to ask a couple of people some questions. Do you want to say your name for the group?
Evan.
Evan? Okay, great. So Evan, what's one thing that you would take away from the conversation that we just had? Doesn't need to be big. It could be something super small.
Focusing in on etiquette and making it personal.
Okay, great. Absolutely applicable towards this process.
I'm Emily.
Hi, Emily.
I really like what you said about like you don't have to say anything at like the end of the table, but you don't have anything.
To that point, if anybody tells you that there's a script of what you have to say, there's going to be a time that you could go away from that, okay? Just keep that in mind, right?
Leo?
Hi, Leo.
Other than your perfect sideburns, that the tables are based off the Iberian Peninsula.
Oh, that's what you took? And that was the one thing that I wasn't supposed to talk about today, so see? That serves you right.
Yes, I'm Susie.
Hi, Susie.
Two points actually really stood out to me. First of all, don't have negativity about what the customer prefers. So like, catch up with a steak. Like obviously, that's like a faux pas for us. But like, if that's what they want, that's what they want. I feel that very much so with bartending. And like, if someone doesn't like the way I make an old fashioned, tell me how you like it. That's fine. I'm not taking it personally. So I appreciated that point being stood out. And then I also appreciated, don't interrupt the guests if they're talking. Like if you want to check in on the table, but they're obviously fine, they're looking good, no one's making eye contact with you, kind of step away from that traditional role of needing to interrupt them.
Yeah, great. So those are, I think that's enough of show and tell. I won't put anybody else on the spot. There'll be ways, but obviously, as I'm calling out people, it's also a thing for me to learn names. I never remember a name. I can never forget a face, and I can never remember a name. I can barely remember my own. So it's as much for me as it is for you guys. But what we'll do is we'll build on all of these conversations that we're having. And by the way, you're a participant in them. So there's going to be times as you feel more comfortable and confident that as we have these conversations, I'd like to see your voice come more naturally at the end when there might be questions that you might have or thoughts that you want to interject. So I'm going to leave it open to everyone. And by the way, there's no judgment if nobody wants to raise their hand right now because you've all just met each other. But is there anybody who has anything else that they'd like to point out or any questions that they might have from this conversation that we had?
Are all the properties, are any of the properties reservational?
So we will always try and accommodate walk-in guests. Some of our properties are more focused on reservations. So for example, 12's is more dedicated towards reservation based, mostly because there's a strong format of how people will choose to engage with that space versus others, right? So you have to prepare in advance for that, enough time, etc. Whereas somewhere like Evo, which is meant to be more informal, it's meant to be led by meze, which is smaller plates, that is a space in which we're going to have a greater proportion of walk-ins that are available to it. So I would say that there's not a one-size-fits-all. It's based on the restaurant, but we would always want, even in a space that is more rigid in its format, like 12, we would still want to offer the opportunity for walk-in guests. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? That was a really good question, by the way. Any other questions? Okay, great. Awesome. So use restrooms, go outside, get some fresh air. Feel free to take this next half-hour period. So we are now at 11:37.